Colour signs as Ferrari takes Plan E to mean Plan Explode. Charles Leclerc takes victory from Max Verstappen, and Mick Schumacher, he is up and coming and found his groove. G'day, my name is James Baldwin, and welcome to another episode of Lakeside Drive's F1 podcast. In this episode, we review the Austrian Grand Prix. And I'm joined by my friend and yours, it's Freya Brolsma. G'day, mate.
Hello, how are we going?
Oh, good. We're all very excited. I feel like we overdid the excitement in the opening. We're doing very well. Doing very well because it is the second best race of the season in my mind, and it was immediately after the first best race season for the season so far. Formula One really coming back into its own on some pretty brilliant tracks, Freya. We've had a bit of an interesting year in terms of who's been leading the championship, but for a sprint weekend, this was a spicy meatball.
A spicy meatball. Yeah, it was. And it was so great to have an exciting race off the back of an exciting race as well, 100%. We had a great time watching this. I was saying to you earlier, it was strange because I was watching it with two Red Bull fans, and I get confused sometimes when they cheer. I kind of turn around like, why are you cheering? Oh, that's right, you go for Red Bull. I forget that Red Bull as a team has actual fans. But we had good fun. But no, let's go back. I really enjoyed it. Good race.
Yeah, I think you're right. And look, if we cast our minds way back into the deep, dark depths of the pandemic, the opening double header that we had for the Austrian Grand Prix and the Styrian Grand Prix absolutely delivered. This is a track that I think we all can agree on across the podcast panel, and probably for a lot of our fans too, Freya, that we all really enjoy. It's certainly, well, and look, normally, and I said this in a couple of interviews I did previous to this race happening, is that, well, generally, Max Verstappen loves a home race for Red Bull, and Sergio Perez would be silly to not come in second. Amazing results, really, that the actual race, the sprint kind of felt like what Red Bull would then be performing for the race itself. But the race results itself, phenomenal result for Ferrari to get out on top. And really for the first time in a long time, I think that we haven't seen that Red Bull domination here at the Red Bull Ring, which is good to see for the championship, Freya.
It is. It's kept it all very interesting still. You know, we're well and truly into the season now, and I think, like you said, after the sprint race, you know, it was exactly as we were sort of expecting it to pan out. I kind of expected the race today to be just a longer version of the same thing, really. Basically us getting bored watching Max go around in circles, probably start, I don't know, singing a song to himself or something to keep himself entertained, and it just wasn't what happened, which was great. You know, really pleased that that's not what happened. But, you know, I think it's just fantastic as a spectator that at this point in the season, it's still so interesting when it comes to both championships. And I think as far as the racetrack goes, I just love seeing fan-based tracks. And I think there's a lot of discussions at the moment about places like, you know, Vegas and Miami and all of that stuff, and it just doesn't feel like it's built for people who love the sport, and that's because it's not. So it's really refreshing to come to Silverstone and then to Austria, where you just suddenly feel like you're getting back to the essence of the sport and what we really love about it.
And I think having a double header too in that same kind of vibe really helps rejuvenate the fan base as well across the world wanting to watch this brilliant sport. To me, the title fight still isn't clear yet. We're now over halfway in the season, which is ridiculous. It feels like we've already had a full season to date. But it's going to be very interesting now where we go from here in terms of interesting races. Of course, we've got France next, that we know that Campy's absolute favourite racetrack. He loves it. He wants more races at the French Grand Prix if possible. Paul Ricard, his absolute favourite. And then we go to the Hungaroring before we have our summer break, and then come back to Spa, and it's then some amazing racetracks again. So I think you're right. It's absolutely brilliant comment and point about building these new tracks in different locations, as good as it can be, and potentially the vibe around the actual race itself. You just can't take away how good racing is on a track that is covered in orange smoke most of the time. And that is, well, I mean, Zandvoort's pretty okay, but in my mind, that's always going to be Austria.
100%. I felt really bad. We'll talk about the track a bit later as well, but I felt bad for the fans who were sitting at the back of some of those grandstands who wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Like, it would just been a weekend of orange smoke, and they would just hope that obviously that Max was out the front, and they're probably shocked when they found out that they weren't, because they wouldn't actually have seen anything through the orange haze. So that's an interesting one. Sometimes you kind of think about the people there, and obviously when you're watching on TV, it's such a different experience in terms of what you see in comparison to being at the track in person, both of the fact that you can only see, you know, the corner in front of you for the most part, but then not even that if you're in Austria. So an interesting experience for the people who were there, I'm sure.
Well, let's get into our favourite part of the podcast. It's Tommy T's television broadcast review. And Tommy T is a sick boy this week, Freya, so we will have to do our best at being the best presenter on the podcast, channel our inner Tommy T, and think about the weekend. Let's talk firstly of the national anthem, Freya. We had a metal version last year, which was beyond amazing. I feel like we got that out of our system last week with God Save the Queen, or with an enormously amazing riff. And then and I didn't say this last episode, but at the very end, he's like, yeah! Okay, good. As excited as you can get by a very short anthem, I suppose, is good. But how did you see the anthem?
Well, they've gone from one extreme to the other, like, you know, hard rock through to ultimate classical. I think there was a comment in the Discord saying, wait a second, is this I Will Survive that we're about to break into? So you couldn't actually distinguish that was in fact the anthem for a moment there, as that they stuck into it. But I don't know, like we're pretty critical of these things, but I just like seeing them doing something different. And hey, they haven't tried to turn the flag into a dress, so I think they probably did the right thing by just, you know, really letting the music speak for itself. So I'm happy with that. It's very different to last week, so that's a bit fun. And we had a flyover, which was a refreshing change. So that's going to add some points, I think. I mean, I've never been sure quite of Tommy's scoring system, but I think that when we actually have a flyover, that might help. What did you think?
Yeah, look, to be honest, we're probably going to deduct points because of the lack of metal. I know that we've gone in a fairly decent direction, but I think when you set the standard and the expectation of how awesome it's going to be, going the other direction is always quite difficult. But to have a flyover, and maybe this is the magic, the little magic dust that Lewis Hamilton gave us in Azerbaijan last year, that we've managed to keep for the good races. It starts with a flyover. It happened at Silverstone with the Red Arrows. It happened here with the Red Bull Air Force in Austria, some classic aircraft too. And we already know that Red Bull is an absolute behemoth when it comes to a business, but the way that they do things is always that next level. So of course you're going to have a flyover. Of course you're going to have a helicopter going upside down and wingsuits and parachutists and all those sorts of amazing things. So I think whilst we're deducting points of the lack of metal, we're going to absolutely increase points, Freya, for the awesome flyover and the aerobatics displays over the course of the entire weekend. Who knows how Tommy rates any of this, to be perfectly honest. I feel like we should try and get something put in writing as to what he actually rates it for. But let's talk about the actual broadcast itself. One of my notes is that there was at least two moments where the TV director played exactly the same thing over again. So I think it was an overtake of Max Verstappen, and then it was still an overtake of Max Verstappen in the next frame rather than thrown to another camera. That was very bizarre. It happened twice, and then the end of the shot, it rewinded a little bit. So that was very odd to see. But generally, it's very hard to mess up Red Bull Ring because it's such a picturesque location.
It is, and there was an incredible scene. I think it might have been actually after the race had finished, as they were kind of doing panning shots and stuff, and you had the orange mist with that huge bull, and that's pretty dramatic. Like, I think it is pretty impressive, and like you said, they do this type of thing well. From a TV director perspective and kind of general broadcast, yeah, there were moments where it felt like they didn't know where to look, almost. And you had commentators saying, "Oh, there's a bit going on down there in 7th and 8th, but we probably won't see that, and they were almost kind of trying to hint towards what they wanted to be seeing in front of them. So, yeah, I think from the actual kind of spectator's perspective in watching the race, it wasn't a great experience.
What did you think of the Sky presenters this weekend? We had Uncle Johnny back, which is never a good thing, but it almost sounded like Martin Brundle was quite ill, quite sick. Maybe he's got long COVID or something. He sounded a bit raspy, and he wasn't his usual singing poetic self whilst doing lap-by-lap analysis.
Well, it's just inhaling all of that orange smoke. It does things to your lungs,
yes,
I think. It's just done a bit of damage maybe. But I thought that he did sound a bit off, didn't sound like himself. But Johnny just, honestly, from a broadcasting perspective, when it comes to commentary, coverage, overall wasn't a great experience in my view. I think what saved it was the Red Bull show. But, we didn't always see what we wanted to see happening on track. It was pretty confusing with the commentators at some point. So I'm going to give it a 2 out of 10 for broadcast, but a 7 out of 10 for the show, the epic show, Red Bull show.
Look, you've gone
Dual
full Tommy
scores.
T. I was going to say full Tommy T. Absolutely makes no sense. We're going to have 2 scores,
No.
2 out of 10, 7 out of 10. Why not? I'll back you in with that. Tommy T, I hope you get better, mate. You're probably not going to listen to this episode because you're not really that much of a supporter of the show, are you? But if you want Tommy T to get better, I think just saying the word Jeopardy every couple of hours just sends him all of the good vibes that he needs. Let's move on, Freya, to talk about some news. There wasn't a lot of time to sort of debrief, was there, between Silverstone to Austria. We got here and it was pretty much go because of a sprint race weekend. There is only one thing that is worth mentioning, and I will mention it very quickly, but we'll talk about it in more depth in a later episode when Campy is on and joining us. There's been some tweaks to the financial regulations. Apparently, there's an increase of 3.1%. For inflation, for budget caps because of cost of goods and everything else, which is the boring part of it, I suppose. But the interesting part for me is the plank and skid updates for all cars are happening from the Belgian Grand Prix onwards, so the other side of the summer break. If you watched any of Ted's analysis over the weekend, you'll know that some teams have been making some interesting design decisions when it comes to where they're putting the planks and the skids and what can actually flex in a bit of a grey zone area for the regulations. So flexi floors, although Christian Horner calls it rubbish, it looks like it has been happening. And for those cars out the front, which is Ferrari and Red Bull, it looks like they've been doing it to enable to have a bit more of an aggressive rake, more control, less stalling underneath the car, and less porpoising. So we'll get Campy to explain that in a later episode because we'll dive into more technical analysis on that ahead of the restart of the season after the summer break. But Freya, again, as I said, very, very short weekend because of a sprint race weekend. So qualifying Friday, and we had free practice 1, which was interesting and not interesting. For Valtteri Bottas, he was taking a brand new power unit, so it didn't matter what he did over the sprint race or really for qualifying, he was going to be starting at the back of the pack. But as I mentioned at the very top of the episode, when it came to qualifying, it was very much what we expected from Max Verstappen.
It was. I think what was most interesting, though, with qualifying was just how close the margins were as well. Like, I think in Q3, when they actually got to final lap times, we're talking like 0.008 between second and sixth, like just really, really close margins. So when you start talking about track limits and everything else and the impact that has when you're talking with such minute kind of quantities, that really does start to have quite a big impact when it comes to those lap times and ultimately who makes it through to Q2 and Q3. But I think qualifying was funny because, again, the track limits, there's probably a shorter list of who didn't get lap times deleted during qualifying. But ultimately that leads to the conversation about Checo and why it took so long for them to dish out his penalties. And, there was a few criticism this weekend floating around when it comes to stewards and decisions and all of those types of things. But to me, that's actually one of the biggest ones because other drivers were getting their lap times deleted kind of in situ, and that can change outcomes pretty drastically because, do you have time to go for another lap? No. Okay, that means you don't make it through. All of that stuff, like it impacts what happens next. So as much as they penalised it retrospectively, the damage is done in terms of the impact that drive has had on qualifying and therefore sprint race and therefore race. So that to me is actually one of the biggest issues of the weekend. And it was interesting because Checo and Christian Horner both said, like, yeah, fair, he did exceed track limits, but why didn't you call it at the time? That was their problem, as opposed to whether or not there was any question that he had in fact kind of gone outside the limits there. So yeah, it kind of went as expected. It's always been a bit of a tricky one for them to police consistently. And I think they did police it, with the exception of that, fairly consistently this weekend through qualifying, and then for the rest of the weekend. Now the next part is for them to get it right race to race. I think the challenge there, though, is that it varies between tracks so much in terms of things like visibility and even time of day. So the sun's in their eyes, so they're not able to see as well, and they're kind of saying that was having an impact there. So it's not as straightforward as it probably sounds to say just apply the same rule consistently, race to race. As long as they kind of do it within the weekend, then maybe that is the best that they can do in terms of adapting to what's going on that given race. But not real any surprises for me in terms of qualifying. He said Max was out the front. It's kind of what we expected to happen. Like the race, the weekend took off as we expected it to continue. But that's when we really started to see that the Ferrari was going to have some good pace. Yeah,
this track limits conversation is an interesting one because I think it's great, to be honest. And it was heavily policed this weekend, much shorter lap, much shorter racetrack, I should say, than a lot of others. And the white line is the track limit. One of the things I find very interesting out of it, though, is it very clearly shows these new Formula One cars are very, very difficult to see out the front with, as Martin Brundle put it, the mud guards effectively on the very front inside lines of the cars. It's very difficult then to see where you're actually putting that wheel. So it's an interesting one because the white line is the white line, that you just drive within that. Okay, fair enough, good point. But if, yes, other environmental factors come into play, it was where you can actually see the car. That's very hard. But also when you're carrying such speed, especially through turn 9, 10, and the car is drifting and you're pushing it to the limit, and you're really finding those extra margins and millimeters count when it comes to lap time, as you say that. The spread of cars at one point was phenomenally close, and it's really where you could put it at sort of hang it out, I suppose, to get that drive off the line coming down the final straight. But it's interesting. It was a very interesting race to see all of these like black and white flags. I've never seen so many black and white flags in my life. And whether or not it's the right way to do it in terms of policing every single corner at the Austrian Grand Prix versus other tracks, I think that opens it up for conversation. But either way, the rules are the rules, so you got to sort of make it stick. And I suppose if it becomes more of an issue later, they'll have to find a way to increase or improve rather visibility of those front wheels so that the drivers can see exactly where it's happening. In saying that, not every driver was suffering from that issue. So, you're Esteban Ocon, you're so tall, you can bloody see everything.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well. Like there are some drivers who seemed to really struggle with it and were getting constant warnings and then ultimately penalties. And there's others who didn't get any, who, for one reason or another, and it could come down to that type of setup, even from the physiological perspective of what you can see and can't see at various heights and whatnot. But just from a driver's standpoint, there are some who didn't seem to take an issue with it all weekend, didn't have any warnings at all. So, what is allowing them to have better perception of that space in comparison to others. But even some of the people who did, some drivers who did kind of go over track limits more frequently, weren't necessarily arguing the rules. They were going, well, it's the same for everybody, and I didn't do it that well. And the other thing is that you don't always win out. So there might be one or two corners where actually really pushing the limits of the track are beneficial for you. But there's others where you actually lose a bit of time. But we can even think about when it comes to track design, though, for example, and things like that, in different ways to have it self-regulate, for example, in terms of having gravel in certain areas. So there's just no benefit to actually, pushing the track limits in that way. So there's probably a few different ways I could think about it, get creative when it comes to having that as something that self-regulates rather than something that has to then be policed as heavily as it was this weekend. But I think, like I said, for me, the issue was really in qualifying with Checo, because the damage is done, and it affects not just him. So that was something which I found frustrating.
I think we could probably skip over McLaren's struggles, because that seems to be the theme of the year for Daniel and for Lando. Interestingly, though, Ferrari pace was really up there. I mean, Charles Leclerc qualifying in second, Carlos Sainz in third, and more interestingly, other Ferrari power unit cars, Magnussen qualifying in sixth and Mick Schumacher qualifying in seventh. This team has not brought a single upgrade to their car yet. And don't forget, they've had to spend a lot of money on fixing Mick Schumacher's car twice. So the team really seemed to be getting into a good groove, Freya, with this car. And it's almost interesting, isn't it, when other teams have started to bring upgrades, not necessarily in the right direction. Maybe there's something to be said for stick to what you know and work out exactly what you need to improve come the summer break, so you can work on that and move forward as a team.
Yeah, potentially. And they would all be in different situations in terms of how much data they have and things like that, in terms of, good long runs. You've had, like you said, with Haas, mix of it. It's very easy to forget about those early races. They seem so long ago now. There would have been a lot of time, money spent repairing his car, and also you lose lap times in terms of data, building that data, and therefore being more confident in what it is that you need to actually improve as well for the rest of the season. So I'm sure there's a million and one variables that help them to decide what to bring and when. But it was interesting in qualifying to see both the Ferrari powered vehicles up there, but didn't expect them to necessarily deliver over a race distance. I thought that the Red Bulls would have more pace ultimately, rather than kind of single lap speed.
And of course, the other important thing to note in qualifying is Mercedes both crashing out, both suffering damage on the same side of the car at different parts of the track. Lewis Hamilton suffering into 4 and George Russell suffering into 10. An interesting time. Lots of Dutch fans enjoying them crashing out by all accounts. That's a completely separate conversation, can I just say, around fans at racetracks and the booing and everything else around it. I mean, people will have an opinion about it. We weren't there, so it's very difficult to say one way or the other, both including the Max Verstappen's crash at Silverstone last year, as well as the crash this year. But if it is happening, it's no good, because these are people's lives, obviously. But from a team point of view, Freya, not one but two cars. Didn't really matter that much for George Russell. Was still good enough to put in a decent time. But for Hamilton, relegated down to 9th, was no good for him.
No, and it really sets your team up for a lot of work over the weekend. And I think it's just from there, it's a recovery drive, right? Like it just changes how you have to go about things. But at the same time, what we know about Lewis Hamilton is that, just because he's starting from the back end of the grid somewhere, or even though, obviously he's only halfway back, but when he has started, back in kind of 18th, 20th, whatever, just depending on whether he's taking a new power unit or whatever it might be, that doesn't rule him out. He is such a good driver on that front that just because he's been relegated for one reason or another, that's not going to rule him out. So it's funny when that happened. When that happened, a lot of people saying, Mercedes aren't actually that quick this weekend. That's going to be pretty hard work for him in order to keep decent points. I was like, have you watched Lewis Hamilton before? And he's on the podium last weekend, so he's got something in that car that's actually setting him up pretty well. So I wouldn't rule him out. I think more than anything, you just feel for the teams in terms of the hours that they would have had to done to get that car, not just on the grid for the race, but in good shape and safe for the driver to get into as well.
Well, the sprint qualifying session was shortly after FP2, which I don't think anyone watches over these weekends, especially when it comes to the juice really being in the sprint race / qualifying. Let's talk about that now, Freya. The very disappointing fact, though, is that Fernando Alonso was sat on his jacks with tyre blankets on. An electrical issue with the car means they couldn't get it started. They were lucky enough to trundle it along into the pit lane, but they still couldn't get it started. Devastating for him because Alpine seemed to be going strength to strength to strength. Otmar Safnauer was asked, what is it about this car? What about these upgrades that Fernando seems to be really leaning into? Because his performances have been fantastic. He hasn't been in the fastest car for a very long time in his career, but he's consistently sniffing out these top 6 positions, which absolutely belong to Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, generally anyway. And he's always there to sort of snap it up. Devastating for him because a sprint race to set the grid for the actual race, he's absolutely going to get in up there and go, righto, here you go. I am a wily old campaigner and here I come. It's devastating to see him not even start at all and be relegated to the very back of the pack.
Yeah, it's confusing. And it's confusing as a spectator as well because you don't necessarily have all that information at the time, right? Like we can sit here now and say, oh, this is what's happened. Even then we don't necessarily have all the information, or they might not have released everything yet. They might not know yet. But, you're sitting there at the time going, why are the tyre blankets still on? Why is the car still in the garage? Okay, you're in the pit lane. Nope, it's not starting. You don't have all of that information. So you're kind of just sitting there speculating, and it's not easy to watch as a spectator, especially if you are supporting that driver or team and hoping for them to have a successful weekend. So, yeah, that was really frustrating to watch. But, yeah, the sprint race, is it a race? Also, I'm still confused. I don't know. Like
Nobody knows.
It kept getting – no one knows. They don't know. But even like I thought that they might have sorted out their language around that this year. They've done this a few times now. But I found, what was it? They kept calling it a little race. We've got our little race on Saturday. And I was like, I mean, they're still going around corners at a couple of 100 kilometres an hour. It's not really a little race. It's, I don't know, just I find the language around it bizarre and it's confusing in terms of, is it a race? But there was drama right from the start, like you said, with Alonso, which is frustrating. And, by all accounts, this weekend he could have been considerably higher up there in terms of the points that he would have been battling for potentially had he not had to start where he did. And then, of course, we had the Alfa's engine issues as well. I'm not really sure what ended up happening there, but Joe just lost power.
Lost power, managed to start it again. What's better than one formation lap? 2 formation laps, I hear you say. Correct. Joe is, he says you're welcome for that point. But for that to happen, but then for him to, the medical car drove past him thinking, okay, well then he's not going to be involved in this start. But for then him to be trundling along and at the back is a good thing. At the end of the day, let's not forget that huge crash that he's just had days prior. And he's in the car having a good crack again. So I think from a point of view of being able to get the car rebuilt, well done, Alfa Romeo, you'd kind of expect some kind of gremlins to be in that thing considering the absolute knock that it took. So I was just glad that he was able to get it started again. Disappointing though, because from a qualifying point of view, okay, 14th, not the best, but certainly better than starting at the very back of the pack, which is where he ended up having to start finding his way through past Seb Vettel, Latifi, Tsunoda, Albon, and Gasly to get back to where he should have been. It was an interesting one. But Freya, for me, for the sprint qualifying race, little race, big race, it was the battle between Mick Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton, and this Haas versus Lewis Hamilton amazing conflict that was happening lap after lap after lap after lap. Kevin was able to keep for a little while Mick Schumacher in his DRS, meaning that the Ferrari power unit in terms of power, obviously a lot stronger than Mercedes, able to defend even with DRS for Hamilton. It was beautiful to watch right up until the point where Kevin decided that he'd had enough and was actually just going to go further up the road. And as soon as Mick Schumacher lost that DRS, it was lunchtime. It wasn't hammer time. It was lunchtime for Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, it was so good to see. I think we've all been hoping for Mick to get opportunities like this to race properly, especially now that he's got that car underneath him with a power unit that seems to be doing pretty well. They've had a bit of bad luck, obviously, this season. They had some strong races that made us all really pleased because we didn't enjoy watching them just struggling at the back race after race last year. So I think really enjoyable to watch and just good to see some of the potential there with Mick. I think we just don't get to see enough of it, and now, fair to say, he has crashed a bit as well. That's partially why. But but just great defensive effort from Mick. But the other thing with that kind of battling situations, you also had like VB lurking in the shadows as well, just waiting to see what would happen there. And I always like watching that now, especially with the 2022 cars. It's quite different because they're all racing, generally speaking, a lot closer together, where it's often no longer a battle between one or two cars. There's 3, 4, 5 in the mix, and that's obviously, it's exciting to watch to see what's happening up the front. And we'll get to the race in a minute. But yeah, we had some great moments there where it's not just one or two cars, and you're kind of looking to see who's in the background ready to take advantage of an opportunity that might open up depending on what's going on with that little battle in front of them. And that was VB there, and nothing really came of it. But I'm enjoying watching that this season because we didn't really have that in the years before. But of course, it's interesting as well with what came out after that with Mick's interview, and this is not something I necessarily expected. He was filthy.
He was
with what had happened, and that took me by surprise. I kind of looked back and said, well, wait a second, you just had a great battle, but then obviously there was decisions that we weren't hearing at the time that he wasn't pleased with, to say the least. But we've been talking about this a bit recently in terms of how drivers present in front of the camera after moments like this on track, particularly when it's intra-team, because that's just seems to be a bit more sensitive. And of course, as we discussed last week with Richard Saxby, it's an incredibly raw situation when they've just come straight off the track, take the helmet off, and they're in front of the camera. But I think it is where you see a big difference with some of the more experienced drivers in terms of how they handle those situations. And you can almost create a kind of direct comparison there between Ricardo, for example, and Mick, in terms of, you're both ultimately in the same position. You asked to swap, they said no. And if you look at how they both handled that interview afterwards, there is a maturity there that we didn't see from Mick in that moment, and it's pretty consistent when it comes to the more experienced drivers. So it's just a bit of a trend which it reminds us of the value that the experienced drivers bring to the sport as well.
Well, for the sprint race, it fell out with Max Verstappen first, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, George Russell, Sergio Perez, Esteban Ocon, Kevin Magnussen, Lewis Hamilton not being able to get past him at the end. Mick Schumacher in 9th, just outside of the points awarded for the top 8, don't forget, in that sprint qualifying small little individual race. Valtteri Bottas lurking in 10th, Lando Norris 11th, Daniel Ricciardo 12th, Lance Stroll 13th, Zhou Guanyu 14th, Pierre Gasly behind him with Alex Albon, Yuki Tsunoda, Nick Latifi, Seb Vettel, and Fernando Alonso not starting but ending up in 20th. Well, that's the talking about the sprint. Let's talk now, Freya, about our team-by-team analysis, which is brought to you by us again. Support the show. If you love listening to Lakeside Drive, we really appreciate your support. You can support the show by grabbing a Lakeside Drive tee, hoodie, crew, whatever you feel like wearing. If it doesn't matter what season you're in, there is merchandise to suit you. We ship all over the world, and all of the funds from that go to supporting this absolutely... Well, I'm having a lot of fun doing a Lakeside Drive podcast. We'll get into our team-by-team analysis. Freya, let's start at the very, very back of the pack, which is a very unfortunate and a very spinny boy, which is not really a surprise to anyone that's been watching the sport for quite a while. Sebastian Vettel, 17th for Aston Martin. Lance Stroll in 13th. And before we get into it, I want to read this that happened out of the a drivers' meeting that happened on the 8th of July at 7:30 local time. It's very important information for you to know. And it's about Sebastian Vettel. The fact is, behaviour during the drivers' meeting at 7:30 on the 8th of July, it's breach of Article 12.2.1 F of the International Sporting Code.
7.6.5
Yep.
ZXY.
And Article 20.1 of the FIA Formula One sporting regulations, a fine of €25,000 suspended, basically because Seb got angry during a meeting at whatever was dumb things were being said probably by the FIA and decided to leave, and he didn't have permission to leave. He didn't have a teacher's note. He didn't have a hall pass.
Do you think he has to ask to go to the bathroom as well?
He has to, surely. Surely they all do. Interesting note from this, though, Freya, and it's something that we've sort of spoken about a little bit, but it's interesting that to read this. In a fine for leaving a meeting. Anyway, drivers are not free to leave when they want. This being a breach of the requirement to attend. Drivers at this level are role models for every driver around the world, and in the opinion of the stewards, Vettel failed to live up to that standard in this case. An absolute hilarious display of the rules by the FIA, finding someone who picks up rubbish, who is absolutely about trying to increase diversity in the sport. Think about what he did in Saudi Arabia. Think about what he's done in certain parts around the world. He's been the first to bring up issues that happen in races where we're going racing. But no, he is not a leader, Freya. He is a naughty boy for leaving the meeting when the teacher said he couldn't, and €25,000. What does that say, though, to drivers when you can get away with petulant behaviour on the track, you can get away with punting people off, you can get away with swearing on the radio or telling your team to shut up and all that sort of other stuff. But the guy Daddy Seb, who we have all come to love, regardless of his spin ability, is fined 25,000, or at least a suspended fine of €25,000 for clearly being frustrated at something stupid happening in a meeting that he didn't agree with personally, and for him leaving. What does that say to this leadership or this potential role model line from the FIA?
Yeah, I mean, Seb's spinning spectacular aside, it's going to be a tricky one for us to really make an informed opinion about, because if you go and interview any of the other drivers who were there, they're not going to say anything, right? They're going to have each other's back. They're going to say, oh, yeah, look, I think that's an issue between Vettel and the FIA. Or they'll say, yeah, things are dragging on and, it's easy to get frustrated in those moments. I was like, no one's going to say exactly what happened and, throw Vettel under a bus to the media. So they kind of dish out this fine, say that he's behaved in a way that doesn't show the leadership role that he has as a driver. But you're never actually going to find out why. So you either have to trust in what was done, that it was in fact a, display of inappropriate behaviour kind of thing in the way that he might have exited or something like that was disrespectful to other drivers or something else. But then you also go, well, I'm looking at all the information available in front of me, and everything that I know about Seb seems that that's unlikely to be the case. So it's a tricky one because we weren't there and no one else is going to tell us what happened. But I think sometimes in moments like that, it's just about flexing an authority really, in terms of saying, just a reminder, I can still fine you if I think that you have behaved in a certain way. Like it's hard to form an opinion on without having been there, and we'll probably never know, but it seems like a bit of a flex to me. And, in our opinion, you didn't live up to the leadership standards. Well, in my opinion, you failed to enforce track limits in qualifying. So, it's, I don't know, it's a bit bizarre.
It is very bizarre, and I think this is what they're hanging their hat on when it comes to leadership. I think just saying, fine for leaving the meeting when you're not supposed to, fine, but for the additional commentary of you're supposed to be a role model for every driver, why is that suddenly now the point when for the last couple of years there's been displays by all up and down the grid by unsportsmanlike behaviour and really poor form? Seb not doing that, and he's the one that's called out for it. I think it's just ridiculous, but anyway, that just ties in, doesn't it, with the FIA. Lance Stroll finishing outside the points in 13th. There wasn't really a proper safety car for him to do what he normally does, which is just wait for something to happen further up the grid. Seb finishing in 17th after having a contact, which was absolutely no good. That turn 4 really taking many, many cars, that gravel trap, including, of course, the Red Bull Mercedes spin, which is its favourite thing to do. Mercedes' favourite thing to do is to spin a Red Bull at that corner. Let's just ask Alex Albon and Lewis Hamilton. But Aston Martin's still very strange to me, Freya. It's strange because I don't understand why they're consistently this far back. Sometimes they have good showings, but you would have thought with at least the aero upgrades that they've brought and with Seb's driving ability and Lance's ability, and it has to be said, Lance sometimes can really hold on to a position and get points to the team, but we're seeing more often than not them getting this far down the grid compared to, which we'll talk about in just a moment, Williams and Alex Albon in 12th, ahead of Lance Stroll, ahead of both Alpha Tauris. There doesn't seem to be this level of momentum carried forward into this season that we thought we would see. And I know we spoke about that with Richard Saxby in terms of the great people that they might have at the campus at Aston Martin last week, but it just doesn't seem to be equating to anything on track.
No, there's a few teams, to be honest. Then the next one is one we will talk about, that it's a bit of a weekend to forget. But when you start saying that too frequently, it's like, well, when are you going to have a weekend that you actually want to remember, that you're going to take away and learn from, and all those things? And it's not happening with Aston Martin. And yeah, then to go back to those points, like they've been in a huge amount of flux over the last year or so, and that does affect every element that is involved with producing the products and what we ultimately see on track. And I think that's something it's probably easy to forget in terms of what we see, which is a driver in a car on a track and everything that goes into that. And you think about things like comms teams and internal structures and leadership clarity and management roles and role clarity even in and of itself. All of these things are things that are going to affect what happens on track. And so you hope that as they gradually build their campus, which is a word that I really can't stand, for the product, like for a business, but I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, you hope that as all of that comes together and things gradually settle over time, that they start seeing some results. But very disappointing weekend for them. I think something which is frustrating as well with Aston Martin is Stroll's just general apathy after races. When you see the AlphaTauri boys coming out afterwards and they've had a bad weekend or something's gone wrong, they're so frustrated. They want so well to have success. So they want so much to have success, and they're so mindful of the team and the hours that people are putting in, and they are so motivated to try and do better, even if they are frustrated in the moment. But the general apathy that I find that he kind of shows afterwards, I'm finding to be a bit wearing, because I think when you're not performing, you want to see the care in the person who's out there racing in terms of wanting to do better, which you do see from there's passion with Seb still. He's frustrated when they're not doing well, when they get knocked out after Q1. He's again, like there's and you see it coming through his interviews as well, and that frustrates me. But yeah, the incident down into turn one. It's interesting with stuff like that, I think, as well, because depending on who you listen to, there's a couple of different angles. One is the classic, he turned in on me. And the other one is you've got the inside line. It's your responsibility to make sure that there's enough room, and then define enough room, right? So not that it's dissimilar to Perez and George. And to be fair, they were pretty consistent in how they did kind of assess both of those. But not a good weekend for Aston Martin.
Alpha Tauri, as you say, Pierre Gasly 15th, Yuki Tsunoda 16th. They had a bit of probably a harsh discussion, let's just say, or harsh words potentially used out of Silverstone. A very completely avoidable accident that they both had with Yuki spinning around Pierre Gasly there, of course, as we remember. But AlphaTauri, and it's interesting that Richard Saxby said this last week as well, that they seem to be going in a more different direction from Red Bull. Very obvious that that's the case, isn't it, Freya, when they are absolutely flailing down the back. And Pierre Gasly absolutely performed incredibly well last year. There is no shadow of any doubt except for in camp he's been. There are a few shadows in there which I would be concerned about, to be honest. But for him, it's got to be tough. I mean, he's just signed for AlphaTauri again for next year, so he's seeing himself through 2023. Tsunoda hasn't yet been announced to take that second seat, but it's probably likely, noting the Honda involvement still. But for a team that was putting in sixth positions last year, that was really getting a stack of points each weekend, thanks to one man, more than Yuki Tsunoda, whilst he was figuring his life out in Pierre Gasly. It's it's additionally hard to watch, isn't it? Because, I mean, there's all these kinds of conversations around Gasly being swapped into McLaren instead of Ricciardo, and Ricciardo going to Alfa Tauri, and other people being around. And where does Pierre Gasly go? Well, look, he's very clearly a talented driver, but unfortunately, like Daniel, suffering from a car, and Lewis at the beginning of the season, and almost Carlos a couple of times early on in the season too, suffering from a car that they just can't get to grips with, or just isn't clearly that quick, isn't faster than everyone else. And you can have a fast car. None of these cars are slow necessarily, but when upgrades are being brought by other teams that are finding, 7 or 10 tenths a second going from race to race, or every fortnight or every month, then you're going to struggle. So for Pierre Gasly, yeah, he's going to be pissed every bloody weekend when he's not in the points, Freya.
Yeah, he's not going to be happy with where they are at the moment. Like you said, he knocked out of his favourite position of 6 across the line, which he held pretty strongly last year. And yeah, now that we kind of we have maybe a bit more of an understanding as to how that team is going to be managed a bit separately, you think about the structures and supports that come with having kind of a force like Red Bull in terms of just the organisation side of things. And so is that affecting them in how they are organising themselves for each weekend? Gasly just. Yeah, it's challenging, right? Because like you said, we've seen him perform. We know that he's a good driver. I know that there are people who will beg to differ, campy, but at the same time, again, we use this not excuse, but it's a rationale that we apply to other drivers who have performed pretty well given their machinery. He hasn't forgotten how to drive overnight. Now, you look at other variables. You go, if you just take the driver out of it just for a minute, what are all the other variables at play here? And you go, well, there's obviously the car, there's the teammate, there's the management side of things, and there's the organisation. If we know there's going to be change in any of those, it's going to affect them. Now they've got upgrades coming, I believe. They're on the horizon, and I think it's challenging though, because that can be this kind of light at the end of the tunnel of, we've got these upgrades coming, but then, do they perform in the way that we expect them to? And can we then extract the best out of those quickly enough in order to try and kind of redeem ourselves and finish a bit higher, from a constructor's perspective, but also individual results this season. So that can be a bit of, not necessarily false hope, but it takes longer than we kind of expect when we know that teams have got developments on the way. But yeah, they really lacked pace this weekend from start to finish. And what was interesting is that I think it might have been Tsunoda who said, there's nothing in the data to really explain why this weekend was so difficult. So they've probably got a bit of work to do to go and do some problem solving.
In terms of upgrades, Williams seemed to be figuring out theirs pretty well. It was unfortunate, of course, Alex Albon being taken out in the first, not even at the first corner. He couldn't get that far at the Silverstone circuit, but he managed to qualify pretty well in 11th spot from the sprint point of view. He was down in 16th, but he ended up finishing in 12th. Now, Latifi having a DNF, but Williams were able to salvage a lot of the upgrades that they brought to Alex's car for this position in the race calendar. Now, it's very clear they're going down the Red Bull design philosophy as well. Alex Albon, well, he's a Red Bull driver still. He's on loan to Red Bull. But one of the things I think that's interesting, and I think we can probably, although there's some other rumours now around where Oscar Piastri is going, but from what I understand, Oscar Piastri will be driving Williams next year, and I think the announcement will be happening sooner rather than later, but maybe Williams are just giving Nick Latifi a bit of breathing room before that happens, which would be absolutely fair enough if Jos Capito is doing that. Either way, regardless of who's got the other car, Williams have hit the reset button, haven't they, Freya, last year? They've sold. Dalton Capital have come in. Jos Capito's come in. There's been an absolute massive shift in a good direction, I think, for this team. And what we're seeing now for Williams is what we saw with McLaren under Zach Brown's rejuvenation, I suppose, of that team, of that business, and they're on the up, which is good news. Alex Albon is a talented driver. I mean, it's interesting thinking about Alfa Tauri going back to where Toro Rosso was a couple of years ago, and you think of Brendan Hartley, unfortunately, suffering at the very back of the pack too, not necessarily because of his driving, but because of the car that was underneath him. But for Alex Albon to be part of the Williams story and help bring them towards the front, I think is a good thing. It's obviously very important, Freya, for both of these cars then to get these upgrades and to be going in this better direction. But have we started to see now, from your point of view, have we started to see the step-by-step gains that Williams have needed to make to really drag themselves away from being right at the very back by a massive distance every race weekend?
Well, I think it goes back to the conversation we were having a bit earlier, whereby any decision that's made when it comes to the organisation, but then also development, takes time to have an effect. So you might put a new team principal in, you might have a buyout, you might take a different direction in terms of design. All of these different decisions take time to actually affect what then happens on track. And I think that what we are seeing now is, all of those decisions that have been made over the last, 18 months to 2 years really start to, this is the outcome of that. And are they battling for podiums? No, but they are making constant progress in the right direction. And I think that is the outcome of all of those decisions. Kind of, they've been good ones for the most part. And they've managed a lot of that change quite well by the sounds of things in terms of managing George out of the team, managing Albon into the team. All of those things seem to have been done with pretty little kind of chaos, I suppose. There can be a lot of drama when you have driver movement and that type of thing, whereas they all seem to have managed those pretty well from a Williams perspective. So, yeah, I think for them this weekend, like you said, for Albon, it was a great opportunity for them to actually get data on those upgrades because of what happened last weekend. And despite some kind of tricky incidents with him, he made contact with Seb in the sprint race and then had the penalty for pushing Norris off track as well. He still seemed pretty happy with the overall outcome. Like he does seem to do a good job of kind of stepping back and looking at the whole weekend and saying, this happened, but overall this is where we're at and I'm pretty happy with that. We can be optimistic. And I certainly look forward to kind of hearing from him after races. He just, he's optimistic. He's insightful. He never plays a blame game. He'll often kind of say, this was my experience, or this is what I thought happened. I thought that was a racing incident, or I thought this, but they're the ones who are assessing these situations. Like he's just a very reasonable person to hear from, which I think there is a level of maturity there for somebody who has been out of the spotlight for a little while and now is well and truly back in it. I think Latifi, it's a hard one, right? Like it's without knowing exactly what's going to happen next for him. You just hope that he's going to get some enjoyable races in if it does turn out to be his last season with Williams, and this weekend wasn't one of them. I think he had some floor damage earlier in the race, which then would have made the car very, very difficult to drive. We saw the same thing with Max last week, but he doesn't have, the pace that Max does. So, with that damage, it's in their best interests just to try and, save the power unit and retire the car. So I hope that's not the luck that he has for his remaining races.
Well, he's certainly Gotifi to many of us here at Lakeside Drive. And for Alex Albon, similarly to Zhou Guanyu, for recovering so quickly from his massive shunt to get back in and be happy. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point, Freya, in terms of his maturity. And he is one of the younger guys on the grid too. So it's good to see it can still happen. Alfa Romeo, Valtteri Bottas in 11th. Zhou Guanyu, as I just mentioned, back for this weekend in 14th. Not a bad showing for Alfa Romeo, just outside the points of both of them though. Valtteri Bottas, as you mentioned, Freya, was lurking at a couple of points through the race. Joe did a great job to get past as many drivers as he could to get that 14th position, though. But for Alfa Romeo, yeah, probably a weekend to forget if we're going to use that terminology for them. It's not been a very particularly good circuit for Alfa Romeo previously as well. You think of Giovinazzi and Kimi Raikkonen's results here, not that great. So for them, I'm supposing they're wanting to really just get everything focused again, recover properly from Silverstone. Now they've got another race under their belt. Both cars finished at least. No massive problems, although, as I mentioned, Valtteri Bottas starting the very back because of a new power unit. So to fight his way up to 11th is good news for him. But for For him, he still looks happy. Regardless of where he is on the grid, he's still a much happier VB, Freya, than he was in any of the previous couple of years.
Yeah, he is. Although I think we just certainly saw some frustration from him this weekend, which is natural as well. I think overall, they were in a tricky position. I think they overall just seemed to lack pace, though, really. They weren't particularly great through the corners. I think they'll be pretty frustrated to not have scored points, but then they weren't in a great position to really achieve that from the start. And as much as Joe kind of, you can be medically recovered physiologically, but there's so much more to how an incident like last week will have affected him. Now, I'm not saying that will have affected his race necessarily this weekend. He started on hards and just struggled there for a long time. I think a lot of teams struggled with tyre management, and he seemed to be one of those. But I just wouldn't underestimate the effect that something like last week would have on your mindset, both immediately and long term. And it's very impressive that he raced this weekend. I think sometimes not having the downtime is actually a good thing. It does force you to just get back into it and not overthink certain things. Can actually help to expedite recovery, so to speak. But the effect of something like last week is not just physiological. And I know it's a cutthroat sport and everything else, but personally I'd be cutting him a bit of slack over the next little while he pulls himself together, which he frankly did exceptionally well. It's just a tough race for them.
McLaren ended up with both cars in the points is not something we were expecting at all. Daniel Ricciardo in 9th, Lando Norris in 7th. Lando was able to have some battles, Freya, but not for the length that we've seen here. I mean, he's done pretty well, hasn't he, at the Red Bull Ring in previous years. His first podium was third in the first race in 2020 in that double header. So McLaren generally have been pretty good for this racetrack. Very limited running, issues with Daniel Ricciardo's DRS. To be honest, they have to be absolutely stoked with the 7th and 9th. Both cars in the points. Rubbish performance really all around for the team. Andreas Seidel's still not blaming either of the drivers, but trying to figure out exactly what's happening with this team. And let's not forget Andreas being the team principal. It is his responsibility to make sure things are going in the right direction. That includes drivers in which seat, what the future holds and everything else. So I think it's important to just listen to him and his press conferences because he is the fountain of McLaren Formula One knowledge in that space. But yeah, double points finish for McLaren. It's a good thing. DR, though, seemed to have some frustration. At one point, after Michael Italiano showed him something on a screen, he flicked it off. Gave the bird to the screen. I don't know what was on the screen. Something happened. Very, very frustrating for him. You can see, though, he's deflated. Let's hope the next couple of races are good for him, but also Lando Norris. Let's not forget, I mean, he is outperforming Daniel Ricciardo in this car. There is absolutely no question to that. But the fact that he couldn't really fight for a very long time, those Haas cars shows that McLaren's pace really, I mean, the fact that Haas are faster than them, that says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And I think like there's so much going on here with this team. And if you just look at this weekend, just for a minute, you've had brake issues in qualifying, DRS issues with Daniel, power unit issues as it turned out as well. It's one thing after another. And yes, absolutely, for them to walk away with both of them in the points is kind of miraculous in a certain way. And yes, Lando outperforming Daniel, but he's not dominating him, and even last week, like he did do well in Silverstone, but I would question whether he was ever really up there with the pace and ability to battle it out with the top three in particular. So, yes, he's doing better than Daniel is currently, especially when you look at the season as a whole. But this is not a whitewash by any means. I think it was something that just from a technical perspective, I go back and kind of go one problem after another, and just in terms of how they're looking at the car, you have some questions there in terms of are they trying to solve one problem at a time rather than look at the whole thing holistically. in terms of having all of those teams working together. I don't know. We know that has been a bit of a kind of secret to other teams when they've seen struggling to figure out what's going on with the car. Interviews with various team principals have kind of said, well, we really had to look at the whole thing together, and what we had been doing was looking at one problem at a time and not necessarily thinking about how they all connect, I suppose. So, yeah, who knows? Looking ahead to France, that they did well there last year, so hopefully it's a track that they're looking forward to going back to, and we see them both in the points again. I think that's really all we can be expecting of them at the moment. And if they both finish in the points, given the potential of the car at the moment, it's probably the best we can do. I think the sprint races are interesting for them as well. Like Daniel seems to actually quite like them in that he says, you kind of get there and it's immediately meaningful and there's kind of less stuffing around, but then it's also more exhausting. So I think they're good, but then you have to think about how they sit within the broader season and that type of thing. So having a break after them is important. But yeah, even how you feel about different tracks and that type of thing, but they can affect you. But they did all right here. I think it was 5th and 6th in France last year. So hopefully we could see that again.
And Daniel got an absolutely amazing start. He was ahead of Lando going into 1 and had to get on the brakes because otherwise he would have collected Lewis Hamilton, which gave him a flat spot in his front left, which meant he was struggling, and then on the back foot almost immediately from there, which is why Lando was able to get up the road a little bit more from him too. So as you say, I think there's a whole bunch of things all happening all at the same time. Yes, with Daniel Ricciardo biased, imagine that says it on the tin of the podcast, but can also agree that he's struggling this season. But I think it's, as you say, it's an important note to remind us that the team acknowledges that the team is struggling this season too. There have been performances where Lando has, yes, spanked Daniel. There has been performances where Daniel has spanked Lando. This is Formula One. There's going to be some tracks which some drivers prefer over others. There's good luck, there's bad luck. It just doesn't seem for either driver here in the McLaren fold that they can get any good luck so far this season, apart from Imola, of course, where Lando was able to get on the podium, which was good for him. Haas, though, seemed to be the opposite. No upgrades are the best upgrades. Gunther Steiner having a best time, not looking like a pack of wankers, looking like a pack of legends. Mick Schumacher in 6th, Kevin Magnussen in 8th. Lots of points for Haas, no upgrades. How good?
So good. It was so good. I really enjoyed watching them this weekend. I think, like I said, the interview with Mick was an interesting one. Turns out, maybe that's it. You just need to get him a little bit angry, and then you really start seeing him perform in a race, because he was pretty salty in terms of how the sprint had gone. So that can give you a bit of fire sometimes. So maybe that's the motivation that he needed, but. Obviously, it was exciting to watch the battles up the front at moments, but the midfield racing this weekend was so much more enjoyable. We had, mentioning earlier, 3, 4, 5 cars kind of in any given battle. I think at one point we had a Haas, McLaren, an Alpine, an Alfa, and then the other Haas all going through, what was it? Was it turn 3 maybe? And it was just exceptional viewing. Absolutely loved it. So points again for Mick, which is great. I think K-Mag had an engine issue throughout, actually. So the fact that he finished where he did was actually pretty impressive. And then I think Mick as well got driver of the day, which is really exciting for him. People actually recognising that he has raced well, and kind of acknowledging that. It gives you a sense of feeling valued by everybody watching races as well. So I think they'll be walking away pretty high this weekend.
Yeah, one of the things that was outstanding to me was how he was defending Lewis Hamilton in both the sprint and in the actual race itself. The way he was placing that car, Freya, phenomenal. Like, just absolutely perfect. He wasn't pushing off. He wasn't squeezing out, although he was accused of doing that by Lando. He was... in that instance, he was retaking the racing line, but specifically the fight with Lewis Hamilton I want to talk about is, especially going down to turn 4, just placing that car in such a way that no matter where Lewis was from there, his exit would be compromised and Mick would stay ahead. So I think for him, that's fantastic. The interesting thing is, of course, he fought with a previous world champion this weekend. The previous weekend he's fought with the current world champion, and his mentor is the previous world champion that's on the grid racing them. So he's getting a bit of spice in his driving. I'm here for it. He is super lovely. There is some phenomenal footage of his sister. He's halfway through an interview, I think, with Sky Sports F1 Germany, and his sister comes out with a bottle of champagne and just coats both the interviewer and Mick in it because he was in points. I love that. I love that up and down the grid we can celebrate those victories. And of course, the Schumacher family being an amazing name in that, but his sister being incredibly proud of him too. That just made me very happy. So here for Haas content, either Kevin Magnussen or Mick Schumacher. I think they deserve it. Alpine. I mean, Alonso came in 10th. He got points at the very end of it, considering he started right at the very back of the pack. He was fighting around 5th there at one point on very old tyres compared to those around him. And Esteban Ocon in 5th. I mean, Alpine absolutely doing wonders with this car. They brought big upgrades to the car in Silverstone, Otmar was saying, and really Fernando is able now to get in more into a groove. Fernando is saying this is some of the best driving he's ever done in his entire life. It's a good thing for them, and they're out by themselves. They're their own engine manufacturer. They're their own team. They don't have a sister team. They don't have anything else. So all of this improvement they're making is all thanks to themselves. Some very talented people in that garage as well. It's good to see. And of course, I mean, it's as hard as it is that we could say, we wish Daniel would have stayed at Renault/Alpine, would have meant Fernando Alonso wouldn't have come back to the sport because he's allergic to McLaren. At least now he is. And so it's good to see that Alpine are doing so well, Freya.
It is. And I think I've been talking about this a lot recently in terms of how you feel about different drivers, different teams and their outcomes, and how your thoughts on one affects a thought on another. And we talked about this after it was Baku, I think it was. We were saying it's not that we're anti-Leclerc, it's just that we really love Carlos. So, how you feel about one driver affects how you feel about another. How I felt about Ricciardo leaving Renault affected how I felt about Alpine. I kind of was like, I don't want you to be successful anymore. It's not, and it affected how motivated you were to see them succeed. But as you said, the key is in the mustard, and the mustard is Fernando Alonso, and he is just like bringing me so much joy. He has twinkle in his eye after every race. He is loving being there. And again, this is that comparison between kind of apathy towards racing and loving what he is doing, and being encouraging of his teammate as well, and being so supportive for him both as a racer in terms of helping him defend. We saw that last year, and then off the track as well, supporting him in terms of being a great teammate. So I'm actually really now enjoying watching the success that they're having. And I didn't think that I would ever say that I'm actually really excited about Ocon but when we get to France, we go, he's just had his 100th GP that he did this weekend. He finished in 5th, great points for him. And he's going to a home race. He's got his own grandstand. And he's going to carry the momentum from this. And he was stoked after this race and take that into his home race. So I hope that he has a good weekend in France because, again, he's someone who seems to be really enjoying racing and he's also performing with that car. So I think it would be interesting if you had him not being there to carry points when you have something like what happened to Alonso in terms of, now taking his 5th power unit for the season and then having some issues with his tyres. I think he said he had vibrations in his second set of tyres when they changed him under the virtual safety car. So he then immediately had to stop again, which then dropped him back to P10. And again, as we talk about with all teams, when something like that happens to one driver, the next one has to be there and be able to score those points, which Ocon did. So, I don't know. I was surprisingly pleased for the fact that they were both in the points and I'm looking forward to hopefully Ocon having a good race when he gets to France and being able to celebrate.
Lewis Hamilton on the podium again in 3rd for Mercedes, George Russell in 4th, picking up the pieces of retiring Red Bulls and Ferraris, as they should do. Interesting that the discussion has changed for now about the luck that Hamilton is having versus George Russell. This is his third step on the podium in a row. Second race, I should say. So it's a good result for them. Oh, geez, I'm just going to forget about it. Give up, move on. And George Russell being happy to be able to be in 4th and picking up some points too. I think this is a team that's really working itself out again, really trying to get back towards the front of the grid. Interestingly, talking to some people yesterday about it, when it comes to Lewis Hamilton, there was a lot of dislike that it was same Hamilton podium, can't believe it. last year, year before, year before, year before, year before, year before that, year before that, the year before. That guy's been in the sport a long time, hasn't he? But for this race, and certainly the previous race, we're almost happy to see him on the podium because he's had to work for it. The car is not the fastest on the grid. And it means that he has to pick up the pieces and have some good scraps. And he did. Both of these Mercedes cars, Freya, had good scraps up and down the grid.
Well, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head in the fact that he's working for it now. And I think we do get bored of there being any dominating performance from a given team or driver. We get bored of it. And it was no fun when you got to a point of the season saying, will Max or Lewis win today? Like, just show me what's going on in 6 to 10 because that's way more interesting. It's not boring it's not boring kind of further down the field. And there you do start getting to that feeling of like, well, one of you is going to win, and if I'm not a supporter of that individual, then I don't really care that much. Whereas I think you do approach that and you feel differently when you feel like they're having to work for it. And the other thing I would say is that their success, or Hamilton's kind of success over the last couple of races, shows that the team is actually developing, in that I think we're kind of joined their journey a bit this year, whereby they came out, they weren't as fast, and we were kind of with them every week going, I wonder if they'll be able to, whatever Lewis is testing this weekend, I wonder if that will work. Okay, well, that wing that you had in Canada seemed to be effective. Now you've both got it. You kind of, I don't know, we've been on some sort of journey with them, which we haven't been previously because they were just, Lewis in particular was just dominating. Whereas there's a bit more of a narrative there now, which is perhaps a bit more relatable, and it's been interesting to see. So you feel a bit differently about the outcomes. I think for both of them, really they were epic recovery drives. And I do wonder if Russell at this point will start maybe feeling a little bit envious or frustrated or jealous even, seeing Lewis edging ahead and now having had 2 podiums, whereas, Mr. 5th place is kind of hovering around there consistently. So, I can imagine that's probably going to be a little bit frustrating for him, and he'll be wanting some silverware of his own pretty soon.
Red Bull and Ferrari, 2 DNFs, a first and a second. Carlos Sainz suffering plan E as engine explode mode. Terrifying to watch, Freya. That Ferrari roll down the hill. Here's a hot tip. Campy's not here, so I'll give you a hot tip. If you're a marshal and your job is to have a fire extinguisher and run towards a car if it's on fire, don't put the fire extinguisher down and then walk the other direction whilst the camera angle is still on you. I know you're probably doing something else, but it's a very bad look where the car is rolling down the hill on fire. Carlos can't get out because if he gets out, it just would have been terrifying for him. But trying to stop the car rolling back onto the track whilst on fire and causing further damage to that Ferrari. But there's this shot of old mate just putting a fire extinguisher down and walking the other direction. Luckily, someone else was there with a wheel chock that almost didn't seem fit for the task to stop that rolling car whilst on fire. Terrifying for him, but I mean, that aside, Freya, the bad luck for him seems to continue. It's a story of his season, isn't it?
That's what he said, right? He kind of goes, well, it's fitting. As soon as I get to some momentum, something else happens, and he just doesn't seem to be able to have that continue. It's, again, when you're watching races, depending on who you're watching them with, can change your experience quite significantly. And we did watch today's race, out for breakfast with a lot of people because it's, of course, 8 o'clock in the morning for our time. And you just see the shock on everybody's faces and that genuine all of a sudden the mood just shifts. It goes from the, oh no, power unit's gone, like everyone's, and you've got Red Bull fans cheering, and then all of a sudden they see the flames and nobody was cheering. It was this, what are you doing? Move faster. Like, why are you putting the fire extinguisher down? Just get out. Everyone's kind of yelling at this screen, and because they held the shot as well, which surprised me a little bit. As soon as you get those flames came out, it kind of surprised me that they kept that shot live. But yeah, the feeling in the room just completely changes. And, it was only a few seconds there in comparison to other incidents where it's taken a lot longer to extract a driver from the car. But as soon as there's fire, that's just so scary. And obviously we all have flashbacks to Grosjean, but and it was the added element of the car rolling down the hill, and yeah, just awful to watch. So pleased, to say the least, that he's all right. And then when you talk about it from a racing perspective, it's just so unfortunate. That should have been a 1-2 and he should have been back on the podium, but it wasn't to be. I think Leclerc, though, on the other hand, he just drove exceptionally well today. He did so. He must have. I think he overtook Verstappen 3 times, and it was just every time Verstappen was kind of there, he just kept going. And there was a move he did earlier in the piece, kind of lap 12-ish, and he did that overtake on Verstappen, and you just go, that's a move you see other people lock up so much, and he kind of comes down the inside, and it was just in complete control. And so I really enjoyed watching him race today. But yeah, certainly wasn't reveling in the outcome for Sainz. It's so disappointing.
Turn 4 seems to be the most interesting corner at this circuit. Sainz pulling off there. Perez being punted by George Russell there. That's Mercedes on Red Bull crime that happens quite often on that corner. Charles Leclerc diving under brakes, catching Max Verstappen off guard into turn 4. So it's quite an eventful turn for both Red Bull and Ferrari. For Sergio Perez, managing to keep it going and not getting stranded in the gravel, of course, was good from him. Good to see that he was able to continue for a little bit. I mean, massive hole in the side of the car. They had to retire the car and a lot of issues. I mean, he was lapped by his teammate in lap 9. That sort of ties you up for the rest of the race when that's happening. So no wonder they decided to retire the car. But yeah, for Charles Leclerc, geez, he then had his own issue, didn't he? I mean, the throttle, the little spring in the throttle, something had got into there, which was, I mean, I've never heard someone come over the radio and saying downshifts denied, and sounds like
computer says no.
A diehard movie that's coming out next year. Downshifts denied this summer. But for him, it would have been like, well, hang on a second, what's going on with the car? I've just seen Carlos's car popcorn explode and pull off to the side, and would have seen flames or replay or something at some point, being told by the team. And so, of course, you start figuring out that something else is wrong with your car. For that to be the issue, of course, on the last lap, we saw Max was massively chasing him down. If there was another lap to go, I think Max would have got him again because of the issues that he had. But I was just glad at least one of the Ferraris was able to get across the line in one piece.
Definitely. And I think the other thing for Leclerc in those last couple of laps, I mean, first of all, when he said there's something wrong with my throttle, they're like, no, we can't see anything. It's fine. Sure enough, less than a lap later, that's not working. But then you think about from a driver's perspective, you have so many inputs at any given time in terms of information that's coming in, and then what you need to then do in terms of make adjustments, do this, do that are happening every second of the race. To then add to that in terms of saying, okay, now just, pull the pedal back with your foot and then do this and then do that. You're kind of adding to that, just that mental load or that cognitive load of all of that information that's coming in and everything else that you're having to do. And then you add something like that to it. That's complex stuff just in terms of your neurological processing. So it is genuinely impressive that he even held onto it for as long as he did. But as you said, another couple of laps in it, and I think Max would have got him. But the other thing with the Ferraris this weekend was in the sprint race, and they're battling very early on. Now, I think what was interesting is that Max had so much pace there that I don't actually think that made that much of a difference. And there was some questions of saying, well, if those two weren't racing each other, Max wouldn't have quite as much of an advantage. I'm like, well, he would have had that anyway. But I enjoyed watching them race, and I would like to see McLaren's doing the same thing. Mick got to race K-Mag in earnest today. We know that he was frustrated yesterday, but you've got other teams who are kind of managing this, and I just kind of wonder at times, what stops them from letting them race? Just saying you are racing, don't crash, you're racing though. And the Ferraris found their limit to that yesterday, and ultimately one person comes out of that move ahead of the other, and they go from there. So, and I really it was great to watch. And ultimately they'll say, okay, well, my tyres are done now, so I'm settling in third. But that was really exciting too. So I enjoyed seeing that.
Well, that's our team-by-team analysis done and dusted for the Austrian Grand Prix. Let's now look to our fantasy team name competition. Fantasy. Don't forget, you can join this at any time. It doesn't matter about the point scoring. I'm not just saying that because I'm doing terribly. We're looking for the best team name. Win some Lakeside Drive merch at the end of the year. Freya, here are my selections for maximum giggles ahead of the French Grand Prix. Hold My Red Bull, that's Plan E for Explode, Trent K. White Line Fever, Steen N. The Petulant Child, Kate M. Forget 4 World Drivers' Championships. Vettel knows how to chuck a doughy, Gemma C. Thank you for being so Australian with that. Chuck a doughy. If anyone overseas knows what that's talking about, they're well played to you. What is clean racing, Tara G? Papa Alonso Fingerwag, which we didn't mention, Freya, that when Fernando had time to put a wheel on the grass and also tell off another driver by wagging his finger. Oh, unbelievable. Samuel R, well done. Plan E, Explode. Dennis O, again, that sounds like another diehard. Plan E, Explode. Australia, tomato. Kelly W, fair enough. F1 brand wheel chocks. Jonathan C, very good. Ferrari Plan E, engine failure, LBS. There's a lot of these, I like it. Austria, wow. Well, then, g'day, mate. Oh, wrong one. Daniel B. No upgrades are best upgrades. Michael S. Yeah, damn right. Haas agree with that. What are McLaren playing at? It's just a conversation for another time. Dylan C.
Good question.
5-second penalty for not being British. Nicholas H, good point. Patrols are better than cruisers, Campy, Jason C says. Well, Campy can retort to that later. And the hills are alive with the sound of track limits, Haley H. Very, very good team. Thank you so much, the 155 of you as part of that. But it is now time to end the episode, the French Grand Prix, in a couple of weeks' time. Next week, we will preview the French Grand Prix, and we'll try and get Campy to dissect some more of these flexi floor technical regulations. You know, I love talking about body parts on a car and how they're flexing or not, if you remember the flexi wing from last year. But Freya, a big thank you to you for your contribution this week. Don't forget, you can join our Discord at any time. Join over 300 people. There's a brilliant community there. You can all have different opinions. You can all be Daniel Ricciardo biased or not. It's all up to you, but it's a nice, respectful community to do that. It is time, though, to say goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week for our French Grand Prix preview.
Where we'll all be blinded by the stripes.
I'm blinded by the stripes.
Sure.